This past week in class, Mr. Pascal is covering histograms, bit depth, dosage creep, and more specifically regarding what I'm going to kind of focus in on towards the end of this video is the importance of the exposure index value that various radiography systems will give us out in the field. As he was covering a lot of this material, I connected a lot of dots in my head due to my background in commercial photography. There's a lot of this stuff that when you're in commercial photography, you have to really pay attention to, as in, say, a histogram could really tell you if you've got a good exposure when you're out shooting, even if you're tethered to a computer. Say in bright daylight, you can't trust what your monitor is telling you because you can't see it. So you could use a histogram to let you know whether you're clipping your highlights or your shadows. And then in post-production, you learn to read numerical values that tell you where your highlight and shadow values are, that will let you know how things will print when they go to press. You don't want to have your highlights too hot or shadows where there's no detail. So as he was covering this stuff, I thought to myself, hey, I could really show this to him in Photoshop in real time and potentially really help them understand it better. So that's what I'm going to do here in this video. Just kind of stick with me. I'm going to teach some basic things to help you understand what I'm showing later in the video, what you're seeing. So to start out with, I pulled several x-rays offline. This first one is your textbook perfect chest x-ray. I'm first going to zoom in, and basically we were taught last week or just recently that what you see here is a matrix of rows and columns of pixels. I'm going to zoom in real quick and you start seeing the pixels there. I'm going to zoom in more. As you can see, each pixel is a specific shade of gray. It's not, you don't see two different tonalities in a pixel, it's one individual shade. And keep in mind the detail here, say all the detail there in the lung area, those tonality shifts, and kind of put that in your head as far as how important those tonality shifts could be for diagnostic quality for radiologists. So I'm going to zoom back out, and next I'm going to show you where what's called the info palette in Photoshop. Right here you see RGB. That stands for red, green, and blue. And if you remember last semester, Pascal taught us that the visible light spectrum is made up of red, green, and blue light in some combination. And when you have red, green, and blue light all in equal amounts, it creates white light. And the same thing goes with images. When you start seeing those numerical values where they're not equal, that represents some shade of color, some visible color that we see on the screen in front of us. Since this is a grayscale or black and white image, those numerical values will all be the same. So I'm going to put my cursor over the heart shadow here. You see those values come out to 181, 181, and 181. If I come down here to this area of air to the lower right or patient's left, that would be we have 8, 8, and 9. If I come up here to this brighter area where the rib is, we have 205, 205, 205. So the importance of these numbers comes into play, for photography, because if you recall, Pascal taught us there's 256 shades of gray, from black to absolute white in an 8-bit file. And when I roll over this image at any given spot, that numerical value in the info palette represents where it is in that spectrum from 0 to 255. As I mentioned in class, it's actually 255 on the histogram scale. It starts at 0, so that's the 256th shade. Next up, I'm going to show you something called a levels adjustment layer. Notice the word levels because it very much ties into what Mr. Pascal has been teaching us. I clicked on that and it brought up a histogram up here. I want you to look below it, and you'll see over on the far left is a 0. Over on the far right is 255. Again, there's those numbers. And then down below it, there's a spectrum from solid black to solid white, very much like one that what was on one of our PowerPoints. If you recall, I believe on the PowerPoint in radiography terms, over here where the 0 is represented by S1. Over here where the 255 is would be represented by S2. Here in the center is 1, and that represents the midtones of the image. So what I'm about to do is start adjusting these sliders, which is going to adjust the tonal values in the image. And over here, when I'm doing that, these other histograms up at the top, this is the overall histogram for the image, and it represents all 3 colors or all 3 channels in the image, which is red, green, and blue. Again, this is grayscale. We don't deal with color and straight X-ray, but it's easier to see and understand these, or see this histogram and what it's going to do than it is in this one up here due to this being white. So I'm leaving these up. So I'm about to start pulling in the highlights and shadow side over here. And as I'm doing that, look at what it's doing to the histogram over on the left. You know, this one isn't changing, but this is showing what these adjustments have actually done to the data in the file. So one, you see this come down when I bring over the shadow side, and over here you start, when I pull in the highlights, you start seeing these lines, you know, immediately come in the data side of it. These vertical lines in photography is called combing, and it's called combing because it looks like a comb that you run through your hair. But those vertical lines represent the data that has actually been lost by making this adjustment to the image. Also, I'll go ahead and point out that Pascal taught us that with a histogram, when you have the more vertical values, that represents the brightness and the kind of amount of pixels there are where that specific value lies in the table. And then the amount of from left to right, that's your window. I believe the actual term in radiography is window level, as we learned, but that represents the various the spectrum of tonality in shades from black to white. And so basically this is your overall, all your data as it exists in the image. I'm going to go on to another image and continue to kind of give you more insight in how to read these histograms. Next up is a hand x-ray. Chest x-ray is a long scale image. Hand x-ray is a short scale image. I want you to look at the histograms here for this and how it ties into this being a short scale image and what overall is in the image. You notice that in the chest x-ray, I'm going to turn this off, you have a good amount of data here in the middle, which represents more the middle grays, whereas your stark black is represented by this spike right here. If you had anything that was outright white in this, it would be represented over here. Since we don't have outright, straight white, we don't have any kind of data showing here. When we go to the hand, we still don't have anything that is straight white with no detail, but we have a lot of black or very close to just stark zero black. Not, you see a little bit of space there, but this spike right here is representing all this air that's around the hand that shows up as black in a radiograph. Here in the hand, the bone area, this is represented by this area more up here, and then this area down in here would be representing more of the soft tissue area. Again, you notice that there is nothing that's just stark blown out white here. You have good bone detail. It's a good exposure. So everything's right, but the point I'm getting at here is you see that this represents all this dark area. It's starting to go off the side of the image, the histogram over here, which I'll get to in just a moment. Next up is a lateral C-spine. I chose this because it's kind of a midway between a short scale and a long scale image, I think. You have a lot of different tonalities with gray, but you also have a lot of the kind of vibrance or the contrast that you see in a hand x-ray. And you can actually see it in the histogram here. You notice this little spike of white right here in the histogram on the far right. That's probably representing something in here that, like up here, say this, that tooth actually reads as 248. The value of 248. If I come over here to this area, to the side of the neck, that is at 2. If I go to the center, soft tissue area, we're at 45. Right there, 191. So again, this spike is showing the black area of air that's out to either side of the neck. You may, right there is pretty dark, that's at 25. That value is a good value for me to mention because around 20 to 25 is considered black with detail when you're dealing with images in Photoshop. And when you have 240 to 245, around there is white with detail. If you get above 245, you're just kind of you're blowing out your highlights, so you're going to have stark white on your page or your image the way it prints. And then with when you get below 25 or so, you're going to start getting in your print, when it goes to print, it'll just be stark black, where it could just look like a black hole. And if you're needing detail of that area, you could adjust your images on your monitor based on those numerical values and know that you have detail regardless of whether your monitor is calibrated correctly or not. And monitor calibration is something that I'm going to get into in a minute as well. So the final image I have is of an abdomen. Again, very much a long scale image, boring to look at, but the histogram on this one does show something of value, and that's that you see the data, a good bit of the data is going off the left side of the histogram. And that generally, in Photoshop, that indicates that you likely, or with a histogram, it indicates that the image is too dark. If you see a lot of the data getting cut off towards the right, it indicates it's too bright, it's overexposed. Or in radiography, when the image looks really bright or really light, really bright whites, that means you've underexposed. And then when it's really dark, that means you have overexposed. It's backwards, but the histogram is still the same. So basically, right here, even though this KUB X-ray looks, I don't know, it still looks a little on the overexposed side to me, but really the histogram shows through this data. It's called clipping in photography. Whenever you see the bulk of the data getting clipped off the side of the histogram, you know that you're over or underexposing the image. So how does this why does this matter when it comes to your images that you're delivering? I'm going to actually show you in just a minute with these next two images. Right here is a file that I created in 16-bit, and it's a gradient. I just used a gradient tool that would make a gradient from 0 or straight black to 255, which is straight white. And you see a nice smooth transition from straight black to absolute white here. Again, I did this in 16-bit, so it's actually, even though it's only reading is 255 over here and 0 over here, because it's in 16-bit, the data in the file, there's actually 16,500 something different tonalities or shades of gray from stark black to stark white in this file. But our eye, we can't distinguish that many different tonalities of gray. We just can't. Nor can we see it on a computer monitor. So that, I think, leads people to think, well, if you can't even see it, why does it matter? Well, I'm about to show you. This is 16-bit, I remind you, and I'm about to come over here and do another levels adjustment layer. And this time I'm going to first drag in, you see this says output levels. And remember, Pascal specifically mentioned in class how this histogram could represent output levels. Well, here we go. I'm about to grab this slider and pull in to the 110 point on the shadow side, and we're at 110 there. And I'm about to take the highlight side, pull it down to about 150. I'm going to do it 150. There we go. And you see that now has taken our histogram over here and compressed everything to the center of it, where it's only, the data is only represented in the middle of the histogram, which is your middle grays. And if you look over here in the gradient I created, it's all middle gray. So what the histogram shows here matches what you have here visually. So then I'm going to come here, do another levels adjustment, and I'm going to come up here and pull in my shadows side here, over here to the point that I did, where we start having data, which is at the 110 mark. I'm going to come over here to the highlight side, pull it in to the 150 mark, and you see this is even here where I pulled it in. And here, now you see the histogram, you see this really bad combing, and now we still have a smooth transition from black to white, even though you see all this combing in the data. This combing, again, represents the data that was lost, or all the shades of gray that I basically just threw out because I crunched together, that basically saying what this area here is that was formerly very much a middle gray is now the outright white point. And this area, this line here, that also used to be very much middle gray, is now stark black. So that's increased your contrast. And when, as you recall in class, Pascal was talking about the lower the amount or the more shades of gray you have, the the less the contrast is in the image. So next up is an 8-bit gradient that I've created. And just to answer your question, when I create a file here, you could create, you could say whether it's 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit, and I just did 16 and 8-bit for this. So this is 8-bit. It's the same thing, a gradient from stark black to stark white. And over here, I've already created the levels, adjustment layers, the exact same as I did in the 16-bit file. I just went and did it to save some time. When I turn this on, you'll see that it pops together. And the thing is, when I turn both of them on here, the histogram here looks the same. You see the same amount of combing, but over here, when you look at the gradient, you no longer have a smooth transition. You have these lines that are going through it. And in the photography world, that's called banding. And what has happened is, because this is only an 8-bit image with only 256 shades of gray versus 16,500 something shades of gray that you have in the 16-bit, since all that data got thrown out or crunched together, then you don't have that smooth transition from black to white anymore. So that shows where previously you couldn't tell the difference in that gradient between a 16-bit image and a 8-bit image. And a lot of times people want to sit there and think like, why should I mess with 16-bit? It just slows down my computer. Yeah, you can't see a difference. Well, where it matters is when you start having to adjust the image. And if you recall, Pascal taught last week about how sometimes on specifically the portable, the x-ray will come up and it'll start coming up a little bit at a time, and not the whole image. So it'll start at the bottom and start rendering the image on your screen. Well, the reason why it's doing that is it's applying what he called the lookup table, where it's automatically taking the raw data that's been collected and applying a lookup table where it's adjusting the tonal values to give what it knows to be a technically correct image. But when it does that, it's causing combing type issues with the histogram. And of course, as radiographers, it's not really our job to know things to this degree. I just know it because I'm a commercial photographer. I had to learn it 20 years ago in advertising school. But it does matter, and in a few ways, which I'm about to cover more so in just a minute. But the main thing is when the machine is automatically doing this adjustment for us, it's basically lying to us and saying, oh, your technique was great, when actually maybe it wasn't. Maybe by the time we look at the image, you know, sometimes it just spits out the image and we don't see it making an adjustment. So it may be fast enough to go ahead and do that without us knowing it. But the main thing is if we go ahead and continue on to the next view thinking, oh, our technique's right on there, and it's not, and we're giving too much dose to the patient, then it's a disservice to the patient, but it's also a disservice to the radiologist, because if we've created issues with a file like this in the histogram, and it ultimately creates noise, something, well, as we're taught in radiography, it's called quantum model. In photography, it just, particularly when you start adjusting your values, it starts introducing noise or artifacts that degrade your image quality. So remember when I was showing you the chest x-ray, when you have such minute details that show a fracture or kidney stones, or different tonalities in gray, or just showing the tiniest things that a radiologist is looking for, and they're looking at on a very much higher quality monitor and optimal environment to view it in, whereas we don't have a optimal environment to view it in, a hospital room and say on the portable or the room we're working in. So you may ask, okay, why would you ever work in 8-bit then? Well, an 8-bit image could be perfectly fine when it goes to press, because again, 16-bit, 32-bit, all that, there's so many shades there that our eye can't distinguish, and we can't even tell it, but it shows up when we do those adjustments. And the down point of it though is it takes up more RAM on the computer, and that's something else Pascal taught us as random access memory. Random access memory, you have to have a lot of RAM in your machine when you start dealing with images that multiple layers. Things will get kind of slow and sluggish operating, and particularly when it comes to working with video. And so this may not factor in so much when it comes to the static images that we have with X-ray, but just think for a second when it comes to CT scans and MRI, when you're having hundreds of or thousands, I'm not certain exactly, but you're having all those cross-sectional images that are created by the machine. Then they have to be put together in the computer to render this image and make it where you could just kind of scan through the body like you can with MRI or CT. Well, you still see where it kind of clogs up the image some when it's generating the file for us on a portable, even if it's a straight X-ray. Well, you have to sit there and think, and my insight on this is from being formerly self-employed. Time is money, and you often you could spend a lot of time editing files. And sometimes with my computer, I have, like this computer that I'm working on now, it has 16 gigabytes of RAM, and people would get even more than that for video work, and I'm certain you need more than that for systems that handle CT scans, MRI. But the thing is people don't like to wait these days. They're impatient, and you have to think the vendors that are making these machines, they want to have the images come up as quickly as possible for us, and ultimately our employers are going to want us to have the images come up as quickly as possible, so we could sit and see the image, evaluate it, know if we got it, move on to the next one, then move on to the next patient. You can't, the more patients that we're getting through, the more they're able to bill for. Ultimately, this is a business. It's there to make money, even though it's to take care of patients. So when you're doing images, say in the photography world, a lot of commercial photographers specifically, they shoot raw files and then process from there, because a raw file is a lossless file format. You can't save to it. It's always going to be a raw file that you start with. You could save your raw adjustments where it will reopen, but it's not going to degrade the file if you save it. Whereas, say, if you shoot a straight JPEG in a camera, you could set it to apply sharpening and contrast adjustments straight out of the camera, and you will have an image straight out of camera that looks better than a raw file ever will, because a raw file is inherently soft and inherently loses contrast as a raw file. If you remember Pascal telling us in class that digital images naturally have a lack of contrast to them. They need to be adjusted. It's the same concept. So with JPEGs, also, a JPEG is a compressed file format. And anytime you compress something down, you will degrade the quality some. So in photography, I always shoot raw, and then I will make all of my adjustments in 16-bit, even though the camera may not be creating a 16-bit file. It may only be a 12-bit file. I still make my adjustments in 8-bit, 16-bit, then convert to 8-bit. So how does this matter in radiography? With uh, with with us, we don't have that many adjustments. We don't have Photoshop where we can do all this stuff on a portable. We don't have time to do it. A lot of radiographers just aren't going to have the knowledge to do it unless they're kind of been as nerdy with imaging as I have been in the past. I have to know this stuff. So since we can't make adjustments and we don't really even have a choice as to whether the adjustments are being made in 16-bit or 8-bit and all that, we're just kind of taking and sending what the image is giving us, and we can make some adjustments prior to sending it to the radiologist. We're still somewhat limited as to how the machine chooses to do it, whether it's in 16-bit or 8-bit. What we do have control over, though, is our technique and paying attention to what the exposure index value is for the specific vendor that makes the machine we're working on. And it's kind of been a source of frustration to me that there is no consistency between exposure index values in radiography as there is in photography. In photography, if you take a good quality light meter and it gives you a light reading of f8 at 2/50th of a second, you're pretty much consistently on most any camera with slight variations in the camera sensor, you're generally going to, exposure of f8 at 2/50th of a second is going to be about right. With a few exceptions when you start dealing with large format and light fall off from the lens to the film plane, which is where the inverse square law actually comes into play there. I won't get into that, but basically with exposure index value, if you haven't noticed yet, it could be vastly different from one type of machine or one vendor to the other, one clinical site to the other. So it's important to learn that value because we can look at it and also the histograms and kind of know how accurate our x-ray that we're giving the radiologist is, and whether that machine has basically had to do so much adjustment that the radiologist isn't getting diagnostic information that they need. And this also comes into play, like I was saying, how the time it takes for the machine to process it, but also the time it takes to send the files over the network. Here, my clinical site, just last week, we were trying to send the file, and it was just like clogging up. And it was taking a while, and I didn't even think to mention to the tech, like, hey, shut down the computer and restart it. And that basically, when you do that, it clears the RAM. As you remember, RAM is random access memory, and it's volatile, so it's temporary memory that your the various programs or applications are using to basically the calculation. And when you start seeing things running slow on the computer, it's because you don't have enough RAM or you have too much going on, too many applications going, and when you shut down the computer, it clears the RAM, it shuts down all the programs, you start the specific program you're needing, and your computer will run smoother. So there's that, and then there's also the storage. You think of how much storage space all these different x-rays they're taken by a hospital in a single day, and then that how much that builds up over time, so it takes up hard drive space. So an 8-bit file is going to take up a lot less hard drive space than a 16-bit file. And again, it all comes back to money and time. The management and the powers that be in healthcare, they want to keep us working as fast as they can, be able to store the stuff as efficiently as they can, but that doesn't necessarily always mean that it's going to give the best image quality to the radiologist to view. And I think it really starts with us to try and be mindful of that number that I think, that exposure index value number that I think even myself, we don't pay that much attention to because there's so much other that we have, the patient's mental state, their physical state, machines hooked up to them, all of the factors, getting the angle on the patient just right, the tube angle right. There's all that's going on in our head, and then we set a lot of times just kind of depend on the machine to set the technique for us, unless we notice that the patient's really small patient, really large. So that just kind of gets put on the back burner, I think, and I think particularly with what Pascal is recently covering is really important, and it's like the heart. We are creating images, and that value is really important. Digital is kind of it destroyed a lot of the craft in photography. You had to be a lot more conscientious in photography when you were shooting film, and the same thing goes in radiology. To imagine what the radiographers that was doing this, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when there was all film, they had to really focus and pay attention to what they were doing more so than we do now, because digital has the exposure latitude that it does, and it kind of allows for us to be lazy in some regard. And so I wanted to share this to really just show you all on a screen why it matters and where it could visibly make a difference in the diagnostic quality of the images that we're given. And again, recognizing that there's so much else. There's the textbook way and there's the real world way, but trying to get to the middle when needed, because to just kind of ignore things because the computer automatically adjusts it is doing the patients in our profession kind of a disservice. So I hope you've learned something from this and stuck with me through it, and good luck moving forward with it.